Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me for how to set high expectations for multilingual language learners. I am Tegan Taylor. I'm the subject coordinator for English as an additional language. And part of my portfolio is linguistically and culturally inclusive schools. So I wanted to spend some time today talking to you about common pitfalls that I see when we're not setting high expectations for MLLs and how we can avoid them and keep our expectations high. So, first of all, I'm going to ask you not to generalize. So, even though I am about to do a lot of generalization, newcomer students are literally as diverse as the international student population. Every kid in the world can come through our door, and then they're all under the newcomer umbrella, but that doesn't mean that they're not individuals. So, kind of, this is general information, but it's really important to treat all kids differently. And the SPL is based on research findings as well as my own and my lead's kind of anecdotal experience as we're touring around schools. This is a new phenomena for most New Brunswick schools, and certainly in Anglophone West, that we would have high numbers of newcomer students and language learners. So I guess we're all learning together. So let's get started. I've included on each page a little pause button when there's a lot of text, just to let you know that you can pause. I'm not going to read everything on the screen and then try to talk and have you listen at the same time. So I mean, pause the video as you see fit. So the number one thing, the takeaway from this is that students are individuals and you should get to know them. Very often I will talk to teachers and they'll have me in and they've never had a conversation with their student and they're making a lot of assumptions about language barriers and what the student can and cannot do. And we tend, as a culture in Canada, to have a fear of offending folks. So we don't want to engage in difficult conversations where we might be misunderstood or where we're assuming that the student won't understand what we're saying or vice versa. So I guess push yourself out of your comfort zone a little bit and get to know your MLLs as people in front of you. They're not empty vessels, we like to say. They came with a lot of background and experience. So that's the number one thing. The next is kind of reflect on your discomfort. So if ever you feel you see one of these slides or you hear me say something and it makes you feel uncomfortable because you I don't know, you feel some sort of way about it. Kind of reflect on that discomfort. What are your biases that are coming to the forefront? Do you feel ashamed of the way that you've been doing things? Do you feel angry? What is that feeling that is a barrier for you? That's the only way that we can move forward and grow is with this internal reflection on our own biases. And then apply your learning. So I know that there is a lot going on right now in schools. Um, if you can do one of these things tomorrow and it will make everything better for your students or it will move your practice along a little bit, then I would encourage you to do that. Do what it is that you feel you can take on tomorrow. We're not going to change however many years of practice you've been doing overnight, and I wouldn't expect that. I just expect that when you're seeing this and you're learning and you're doing this reflection, that you apply it in your day-to-day class and then reflect on how that's going. What are the barriers that you might be creating? So, why do teachers sometimes expect less of MLLs? So there are many, many reasons, but I'd just like to give a general overview of who these kids are before I talk about that. So MLL stands for Multilingual Language Learners. You may have heard us refer to these students as ELs in the past, or EAL learners, or ESL students. So MLL just respects that we're all learning our first language all the time. So even though I'm a native English speaker, I still learn new English words. New English words appear in our use day to day. So these students are doing the same thing. They're not just learning English and they have arrived and are now completely fluent and expert in their first language. They're learning multiple languages at once, and English is just one of those languages. So some multilingual language learners will have had consistent and regular access to education in their home country. These are students who are coming to us usually because their parents are working or they're students. They've finished school in their home country. They're grade appropriate. Really, their biggest barrier is language acquisition. So they're sitting in your classroom, but they've got lots of school experience under their belts already, and they have to then learn new language. So research tells us that these students will take about 1 to 3 years for basic interpersonal communication skills, or BICS. So that's the language of talking to your friends, talking to your classmates. That's the language that we learn fastest because we do it the most. We're watching TV, we're absorbing it, versus academic language, or CALP, which will take up to 2 to 5 years. But these skills happen in tandem and simultaneously. You don't have to wait 3 years and then start learning academic language. They will learn it at the same time. It just takes a little longer to learn academic language because we're only usually using it in school. Some MLLs will not have had consistent education. They will be here not by choice, but because they had to usually leave home for myriad reasons. There was some reason that it was not safe to be there. And they will come to your class with all sorts of background experiences and skills as well. But they may not have done the traditional sit in front of the board and in a desk and learn to write in front of a teacher. That's not to say that they haven't had any schooling, but sometimes their schooling has been really interrupted. This is they're still MLLs, but this is another category of MLL that we describe using ELD or SLIFE. So ELD stands for English Literacy Development. They are students who are learning to read and write in a language other than their first language. So you can imagine how difficult that would be. So learning to read and write is a skill onto itself, but we usually teach students that skill in their first language, and they come to us in kindergarten with a whole wealth of background knowledge and a big oral language bank that they learned at home, and then they can learn to sound out words and read and write based on that oral language bank. Whereas ELD students don't have that, so they're learning reading and writing skills at the same time that they're learning English. They will still gain oral and oral fluency, so they'll learn to speak and listen in about 1 to 3 years, just like their peers who have had schooling. It can take 7+ years to learn English reading and writing skills at the level of an English peer. For ELD learners, these are not cognitive delays. So this is a difficulty. We're not going to get into it here, but kind of sussing out, is this a learning disability versus is this an ELD student who hasn't had time on task to learn to read and write? This can be a difficult question to answer. But oftentimes their learning kind of mimics the learning of a student who might have a learning disability. But typically ELD students don't have learning disabilities. They're just learning along with their peers at a similar rate, but just later on in life. So now that we know who these students are, sometimes deficit approach, actually, I would say the majority of the time, deficit approach happens because we care in the wrong direction. So we are making assumptions about what students can and cannot do um, based on what we think language learning looks like. We again look at students as being kind of empty vessels and not coming with a lot of background and experience. So sometimes we're trying to be very kind to them by lowering the bar, but that becomes an issue onto itself. So you can read some of these kind of common things that I see and that my team encounters on the screen if you pause. So they, I guess, did a study, looked at a bunch of MLLs, and these were low expectations that were being communicated kind of accidentally by their teachers. So they were never calling on MLLs in class. So now that we know who our students are, let's look at some common deficit thinking that creates barriers for MLLs. I would say that 99% of the time, these are decisions that are made from a place of care for students, but it's important to recognize and consider the long-term impact of putting students on pathways that we deem easier, for example, rather than equipping students with tools to achieve success while they learn language and content at the same time. So a common thing that I will see is people will place MLLs in non-academic classes, assuming that they're not university bound or not college bound. For ELD students, this may be the case. They may need more time than what a high school diploma can afford them, especially if they're late arrival. But for students who come and only need to learn language, they can often achieve great things and get credit and be participating in academic focused courses. Also, a common thing that I see is that teachers won't work with students if they're part of EIL tutoring groups. So they will think that the tutor is responsible for teaching the student English, and then they'll be my concern after they know English. But we can't wait 1 to 3 years or 3 to 5 years before we start teaching the student in front of us. That's going to create a wider gap. So instead, teachers should be engaging with those students and doing their best to add some scaffolds in. The second is that teachers will mistake language development with a lack of effort. Students who seem fluent in English may need extra time to develop academic skills in writing and reading. So often what I'll hear is, I don't understand it. I think like she can have a full conversation with me, but when I give her a written assignment, it's really low. So that's where this misconception about LDs come in. So we learn any language typically through speaking and listening first. Those are the first skills to develop, and then they'll learn reading, writing after the fact. So a student might be really adept at conversation, but will still require scaffolds. Teachers don't give opportunities always in class to use language. I would say this is true across the board. We don't always have a lot of talk time in class. For MLLs, this is really crucial. So practicing the skills, the vocabulary, the sentence structures that you're learning and applying them in real life contexts will help you learn a language faster. If you put students in safe small group or partner situations, it will take less time for them to learn new vocabulary, and they'll get to speak to their Canadian peers as well, which is something that students report time and time again that they miss and they wish that they could make Canadian friends. Not involving families. So again, we often think that there's going to be a language barrier, that's going to take a long time. Um, I hear complaints about the family never responds to emails or checks communication bags, or they don't come to parent teacher night. So this is often just that the family doesn't know the culture of school. So if they came from a different school system, they may need to be explicitly told that parent teacher is a time that you can come and talk to the teacher. You're allowed to reach out. People may not know what a communication bag is and will need to be explicitly told. Some parents will have literacy issues and they won't respond to written communication. So it's not often the case that parents don't care. It's more often the case that parents don't understand. So if you can involve the family and explicitly invite them, then it'll be a cornerstone to the MLL success. You should be on the same page, just as you would with any other student, with a Canadian-born student. Um, we can't put X student on a PLP because they don't speak English, or we must put X student on a PLP because they don't speak English. Um, this is difficult. I see overuse and underuse of PLPs with MLLs. I understand the hesitation folks feel, and I appreciate that. But you should reach out to an ESS lead or an EIL lead and explore that, because oftentimes I'm watching students who really would benefit from a PLP not get one, and then other students go on PLPs really quickly, often based on data points that are not relevant or would be impacted by students' language. So those are some common things that I see. So we inadvertently, and again, I think from a place of care, may communicate low expectations by doing the things on this slide. So I think that a lot of this comes from the idea that we don't want to put students on the spot. We don't want to embarrass them, or we're making assumptions about what they can do. Um, if you set the bar high and you provide scaffolds to help students reach it, um, students should be able to do all of these things in their own way. So again, students are not coming to us as empty vessels. They're capable of rigor and they're capable of deep thought. The barrier really is language. So if you can provide opportunities, then students will kind of rise to the occasion. Uh, they will quickly learn that if you're never going to call on them, then they don't need to pay attention. Um, if you're never asking them challenging questions, students start to internalize that, and they definitely know when the expectations are high, and they're kids, so they will take advantage of low expectations like any other kid would. Scaffolds that allow your students to communicate high expectations, or sorry, that allow you to communicate high expectations, are uh, giving students safe opportunities to respond in class, especially if you think they should or will understand the answer. Every student should have a My Language Learning journey that's filled out by the tutor. If you don't know where to find that, you can reach out to an EIL lead or your tutor. Uh, that breaks down the can-do statements for the Common European Framework of Reference for Language, and will tell you exactly what your student can do at each level. You can tell your MLL that you're going to be asking them a question after you explain a concept. So you can just give them a heads up beforehand and then let them answer. You can give students questions in advance. You can hold students accountable for their work. Have you corrected, for example, the past tense of to go, and then you had a conference with the student about it, then you can correct it in all subsequent written communication. So don't excuse mistakes that you know that an MLL knows. So don't allow kind of sloppy or careless work, because that communicates to the student that you don't think they can do it, and that you're not going to check. And again, these are kids at the end of the day, and they will absolutely read that and take advantage of that. Return to your outcomes. This is a big one. So I think that we get really in love with our projects that we've done every year, and we pull them out and the kids like them, and then we're marking students, but we kind of forget what is essential at the end of the day with this project. What are we hoping that students are going to learn? And can an MLL achieve that learning and show that they've learned it in a different way? So we, oh, good. So teachers may communicate low expectations by doing the following things. Again, this often comes from a place of not wanting to put students on the spot. We care about the student. We don't want to embarrass them. We're making assumptions about what they can and can't do. But then we're also communicating to the student that they don't have to pay attention in class, or they're never going to be called on. So why they don't have to prepare their answers, they don't have to think about things. Students will quickly get the idea that you aren't going to call on them, that you're going to give them kind of lob pitch questions, and they're not going to rise to the occasion. At the end of the day, these students are students, so they get it. They know what the expectations are for them, and they'll either rise to the occasion or not rise to the occasion. So we can kind of counter this in a number of ways. So providing safe opportunities to respond would just be letting the students know, giving a heads up, hey, I'm going to call on you this class after this explanation, giving them time to process the question, giving questions in advance, possibly. Hold students accountable for their work. So the way that I would go about doing this is, since you're going to get to know your student and what their strengths are, if they hand you a piece of writing and they are never using the past tense of to go correctly, they're always doing the wrong one. And you've corrected it, you've conferenced with the student, then hold them accountable for that. If you know that this is something that they should be able to do, don't let them get away with it, I guess, for lack of a better term. Make sure that they know that you're going to check, and that that you know what they can do, and that you're going to hold them accountable for that. Return to your outcomes. So I think that oftentimes we get kind of stuck in, hey, every year we do this project. The kids love this project. I love this project. It's the end of the unit for X unit. And we forget that there are outcomes that we're trying to test with that project. So return to your outcomes and say, is there something in here that maybe the MLL will struggle with because it's heavily language related, but can they show me this knowledge in a way that isn't normally tested, or in a different way? Can they tell me something? Can they do a video? Can they translate? So can they do first language assignment and then translate it for you? Those will allow opportunities for MLLs to succeed in a way that's maybe not conventional. So what is really important? What are you really trying to test at the end of a unit? And then modeling is another huge thing. So there's something called the hidden curriculum that we all just know. So we went to public school, probably in Canada or in a Western school system, and we know how a poster project should look because we've seen them dozens of times. We know how to stand in a line quietly. We know how to act at a Remembrance Day ceremony or assembly. We just know these things. And for somebody coming from a non-Western background, they don't necessarily know those things. So modeling is really, really important. Um, For MLLs who have limited prior schooling, they might not know what a good project looks like, but you can co-construct that. You can show examples of what you're looking for and then help them along the way to figure out, oh, okay, this is what I really need to do to achieve success. Students will try their best, I think, if they're equipped with the knowledge to do so. So figuring out what students can do and are capable of is a missing piece in this that I think is difficult. It is a barrier. It's harder to know what your MLLs can do versus your Canadian English speaking students. But it's important to remember that MLLs are not empty vessels, as I've said. You can make your content accessible, you can provide opportunities for them to learn in a safe way that still is challenging. Um, the number one thing that you can do is get to know your kids. They're waiting for you to talk to them. I guess if they come in and they're allowed to put their head down and not engage, then they're going to do that. They're kids. Um, Having a conversation, even if it's via a translator or you bring in an interpreter, get to know your kids, it's going to go a long way. They should feel like you care about their success and their achievement. And the number one way to communicate that is to take an interest in them. The second is 3 times per year, tutors, schools with tutors, send in my language learning journey documents, MLLJ, you see on screen. And those are just a series of can-do statements that the tutor will fill in. So that will give you a good idea of what they can do at language level wise. So can they ask a question without a scaffold? Can they write a simple sentence? Um, are they doing these things with their tutor? And that's a great way to gauge what you can expect them to do in your class. And you can work on the same skills. Co-constructing criteria takes a little bit longer, but then students will know what a successful project looks like, for example, or what a successful paragraph looks like, what successful sentences look like if we're getting down to the A1, A2 level. And then revisit familiar topics and texts. One of the big strategies for language learners is to just revisit the same text repeatedly. I know that we often feel like we need to change texts all the time um, to keep students engaged or to build a new lesson. But moving back to a familiar text, even on a test and in a test scenario, making sure that you're not putting out there kind of vocabulary, that it's words that you've gone over in class. If you're going to ask about the number of apples, don't change that to oranges. Just keep it consistent so that it lowers the filter, it lowers the difficulty because they have something familiar in front of them that they've already spent time with and they don't have to learn the content, the vocabulary, and then also answer questions. They have the content and vocabulary under their belt already. Modeling expectations is so important for all learners, but for MLLs, especially with those students with limited prior education. They're not necessarily going to know what a great project looks like. There's this idea or this concept of the hidden curriculum. So the way that we have just been socialized to go to a Western education system, to know what the expectations are. I line up, I have my snack rather than eating my whole lunch. I walk into class in an appropriate way. Those expectations may not be familiar to students coming who have not been part of a Western school system. So modeling those, communicating it explicitly, making sure that they know what the expectations are, and then holding them accountable for those expectations within reason. Sometimes things need to be taught multiple times before it's absorbed, but checking students on their behavior, checking students on your expectations for what a paragraph looks like and how do we do multiple choice assignments? How do we write our name at the top of the page? Modeling those things will be essential for all your students and helpful for all your students, and a nice reminder for ones who've been in class for a long time, but then also for your MLLs to know these are the unwritten rules of school. So anything that we can do to lower the literacy component or the language component of an assignment is helpful for MLLs. So if we're thinking in the content areas, using a graphic organizer, I know that maybe they've been used to death or we're kind of tired of the old KWL chart, for example, but a graphic organizer is a great way to have an MLL show what they know without having to put it in a complete sentence. It's very fill in the blank, but in a way that allows them to engage with content and to show you what they know. So I would encourage using graphic organizers with students. There are all kinds. If you reach out to me or a lead, I can supply you with graphic organizers, or you can just make them together with the class. One of the most common ones is a Frayer model, Frayer, for science class. We've used, for example, to do science vocabulary, and it's just a great way for students to really show in multiple ways that they understand the content that's in front of them. Then translation tools and apps are your friend. Google Translate is the one that I recommend. I would say that most MLLs have it. You can download it on your phone or you can use it through the browser. I would use the actual full version. So a Google Translate will come up at the top, but I would click into it. It has more features in there, as well as like text scanning if you have an iPad or you're using it on your phone. It'll translate text. It will translate photos, for example, and there's a conversation function. It's a little bit wonky sometimes, but having a conversation with your student in their first language can really be facilitated by a translation tool or app. Consistent routines and strategies. I know that when I say a lot of this to people, they're kind of like, this is not new information to me. And it really isn't. So much of what we can do for MLLs is really great tier one instruction that we might be doing already, but we may not be doing consistently. So I had a high school student once tell me that when I asked him, what can your teacher do to help you learn better? He said she puts the numbers of the math that we have to do on the board, but she doesn't always. Sometimes she says just skip, 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 and I don't know what that means. So what the teacher was doing was sometimes she would write the page number and the numbers of the math problems on the board, and he could look there and easily see. And sometimes she would just tell the class orally, and she would say, for example, you're going to do page 45, 1, skip A and C. And that was a lot for him to take in versus just writing it down. So it's just a matter of being consistent. If she wrote the math problems on the board every day rather than letting him figure it out, and she wasn't aware that she was doing that, of course, we're busy and we're kind of doing what we can with the assumption that everybody will understand. But it's going to be helpful if you're super consistent, because then they know you're going to walk into class. What I need to know is going to be here, and I don't need to figure that out on top of the language. And then trust your professional instincts. I think that so often we don't use the same, or I guess we don't trust our skill set as teachers. When we have an MLL in front of us, we feel like we need to be doing things that are completely different or holding them to kind of a different standard than our other students. But I think that we've been in front of, even new teachers have been in front of, dozens, if not hundreds, and seasoned teachers, maybe thousands of students. We know what is age appropriate behavior. We know when a student is being sneaky. We know when a student has low expectations of themselves. We know the difference between head down because I was on TikTok all night and head down because I'm exhausted from learning English. So the better we get to know our students and then also trust ourselves as professionals, the better it will be for everybody. So, something that I often hear is that X student came with a lot of trauma. So, especially our refugee population. And a deficit approach, as I said before, often stems from a place of compassion and care. We fail to hold all learners accountable because we don't want to push them too hard. And this is not to downplay the backgrounds and experiences of our students. That can't be ignored. Of course, it needs to be considered. It has definitely had an impact on some of our refugee and asylum seeking students. But labeling any student as traumatized and lowering our expectations because of that assumption is fundamentally harmful. Um, we should be designing classroom instruction that makes all learners feel safe. So that's kind of the cornerstone of this, is that we're not going to be yelling at kids or, you know, surprising kids with loud noises, and we're not designing classrooms that a traumatized student shouldn't feel safe in. But at the end of the day, the best thing that teachers can do is be consistent. So I hope that you pause to read this. Um, this was a study on refugees that found that 40% of people who came and were diagnosed with PTSD, it dropped to 10 with no intervention whatsoever. So as families come and are acculturated to Canadian culture and they form new memories and they start to feel safe, these symptoms lessen over time. So it's not our role to assume that we can't do something or that a student can't do something because they have had previous adverse experiences. It's okay to still have high expectations for all our students, and we shouldn't be labeling them with a diagnosis with only the evidence of they came from X country or I heard that they had X experience. And of course, we should not be asking students about that, which would only further deepen that issue. People want to come and settle and feel safe and secure. And the stress that they're experiencing is often the stress of moving to a new country rather than the stress of leaving. So I thought that this quote was really powerful and really speaks to what I think the power of teachers and the power of school is. For a lot of these students, you're going to be their first exposure to Canadian systems, and you might be the first Canadian that they form a relationship with. So making sure that your room is friendly and predictable and routine and is a safe space for kids is the best and most impactful thing that we can do. It's an obvious um, kind of solution or treatment to the chaos that kids may have experienced before because school is routine. It has, by nature, a lot of routine practices, and kids can feel really safe and like they can achieve success in that by just learning the routines of school. So there is a quote from a child soldier and a survivor. And he said that when he first came to the United States, what he most needed was to make new happy memories. So, not intervention or people kind of giving him any sort of special consideration for his trauma, but just to like have new experiences that were positive and to give him a sense of safety while he was here. So that's what I think teachers can do. And it's important that we remember that the flip side of this label is that students then can inadvertently learn that we don't believe that they can do things, so they won't believe that they can do things either. It's really, really important that we just scaffold for all of our learners, not just students who have come from refugee background, but to give them the tools that they need and then to give them the confidence that they can do it. So I want to tell you a little story about a student that I had when I was teaching EAL in high school. He was part of the first Syrian wave, and I was teaching an EAL class, and he, a couple of months in, was completely checked out. He had his head down. He was becoming a behavior problem. I see that this says problems. I apologize. He was starting to be rude to me, and he was not attempting work anymore. So, to me, a big professional red flag is I really, really like kids. I really like teaching. I've taught I've taught middle school all the way up through high school. And a red flag for me is when I start to dread a student coming to my class. That's a real sign to me that like I need to make a better connection with this kid, because if I'm starting to feel negatively about them, it's going to impact my my success in class, my ability to treat them fairly, but also their success in class certainly. Um, so I was kind of faced with a problem. I was dreading him coming to class every day because of these escalations, and I didn't like that about myself. So I had to kind of check it. So what I did was I got the class to go to work, and I pulled him to the back of the room, and we sat down on my laptop with Google Translate, and we had a little Google Translate conversation. I've done this in several situations subsequently. I find it really impactful. I think that a lot of the time, our pre A1 and A1 level, our absolute beginning students feel muted and like they don't have a voice. So, this gives them an opportunity to talk to me in a way. So, um, I asked him, "Why aren't you working?" And he said, "I can't do it." So this to me was like, oh, cool. We're dealing with a confidence problem. Not cool, but at least something that's manageable. I said, I'll help. And he said, it's very difficult. And I remember this was the first time that we had had any sort of connection. His English level was really low. So he like kind of looked me in the face and was like, I got the sense that he didn't believe that he could do it. And what we, I think, fail to recognize is that everything in these kids' lives is difficult. So it's not just the work that you're putting in front of them. They can't go and, read signs in the community. They don't have food that they recognize. They Everything is a barrier. So you start to feel like you can't do things. If everything is difficult, you internalize that to a degree. So I said, you can do it. You are smart. And he said out loud, thank you. So I think that he thought that his teachers didn't believe that he could do the work anymore. So from then on, and I can't take credit for this because he 100% did this himself. And I was also given a very tenacious EA that would not let him put his head on the desk and really encouraged him to do well. And he went on to call her grandmother, and he made a card for her at Christmas. It was like a, a 180. So he ended up becoming one of my favorite students. Not that we can pick favorites, but he became super motivated. He was a leader in class. His English came along um, in a huge way. He was helpful and he was like incredibly funny. So I'm not saying that this conversation turned the tides, but it changed my attitude toward him. And if I hadn't had that conversation, I'm not sure that my attitude would have changed. I may have thought, he doesn't care about work. He's not going to do it. I'm too tired. I got kids in class who do care. I'm not going to bother with it. So we spent, a 10-minute conversation. Then I helped him through the work, and things in my mind started to shift. And I don't know what the shift was for sure for him, but I know that I saw a different kid moving forward. So thank you for engaging with this PL and for engaging with any of the PL that you're doing today. I know that my EIL team has some other videos that are up on the same website that you can follow. If you have any questions for me, please feel free to reach out to myself or a member of my team. The big takeaway, like I said, is get to know your kids. They will rise to the occasion, and then you can expect great things from them. They've already journeyed across the world to be here, and you can become a great example of what education is and what Canada is, and what their new life will be. So thank you so much for all you do all the time, and enjoy the rest of your PL day.